Welcome and thank you for joining us once again. I pray that you've been having a good week, that everyone around you is safe, and look forward to a fun and safe Halloween. This will be, I guess you'll have had Halloween already by the time you watch this, but I'll be recording it beforehand. A couple of quick announcements. Just a reminder, if you want to skip the announcements in the Lord's table, you can check the timestamp down below and just skip right ahead to the lesson. If I ever forget to put that timestamp in, I'm sure I've done it before, just let me know and I'll fix that. I'll go back in and edit it afterward. So for this week, the main two announcements are we are continuing with our midweek class. We've had, I think we'll be on our third session this time, working through the Convicted series from Focus Press. And that's here at the building on Wednesdays at 2, just a reminder of the time there again. In terms of, and the other big announcement, the main one that I want to make is we are once again running the Adopt a Star program. Now, this year it's going to be a little bit different. In previous years, you would get a profile of a child and you go and buy some gifts for that child and bring them over to the food bank who would distribute them. This year, to avoid any cross-contamination and to limit contact as much as possible, they're going to just take sort of cash donations, and then they'll have their volunteers go and put those gift packages together. So the way we're going to do that is we'll run a special collection here at the church. And I guess, it won't be so much a special collection. It'll just be the knowledge that, we're making a collection of cash for this Adopt a Star effort. So if you're able to contribute to that, please take your contribution to Dave with the earmark that this is for the Adopt a Star program. And he will then, after we get all the donations in, which we'll do by, I think, the third Sunday or so in November, at that point, he'll write one check from the church, take it over to the food bank. And so we'll still contribute as much as we ever have. It'll just have to be a little bit different for this year. And I'm sure by next year, things will be back to normal and we can look forward to actually having that fun and excitement of going out and finding a gift that we think would be appropriate. So that's the Adopt a Star program for this year. I thank you in advance for helping with that. It's a really, really good effort. We need to be mindful of, the fact that this time of year, well, it's exciting for most of us, and we look forward to all the good things we're going to give and watching our kids with excitement, see the new stuff. And, it's such a joy to see that. But there are a lot of households who don't get that same joy, who are so stressed out because they don't know how they're going to afford gifts and food and all the other things that go along with Christmas. So if you can contribute to that effort in any way, please do so. All right, now let's go ahead and switch gears. If you're taking the Lord's table, please go ahead and pause the video now so you can prepare the emblems or sing a hymn or say a prayer or whatever else you may do in preparation for the Lord's table. Let's take a look over at Matthew's Gospel, where Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper as part of the Passover that they were eating together. And we all know the situation. They're in the upper room, they're eating together, and as they were eating, it says, Jesus took bread, and after blessing it, broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." And he took a cup when he'd given thanks and gave it to them, saying, "Drink of it, all of you. For this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink again of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." Three simple points can come from this text. The first is that Jesus is with us at the table. The second is the purpose for this memorial, which is to remember what's been done and who we are because of what's been done. And the third is the significance of Christ's sacrifice. The shedding of Christ's blood establishes the new covenant. It allows for the forgiveness of sins. And so the only reason there can be a church, the only reason we can be a part of Christ's body is because of this memorial that we partake of. And that's why it's so central to what we do. I hope that understanding will help you and guide you as we take a few moments to partake of the emblems. perhaps outside of our series of lessons from, I guess, a few weeks ago or maybe a month ago now on death and dying and the afterlife, this is going to be one of those subjects that no one wants to talk about. This is going to be one of those taboo subjects, even within the church. And so what I want to talk with you for a little while about is sin. The reality of sin, the nature of sin, the consequences of sin. This is going to be, we're going to spend a little bit of time on this. And one of the things that I have noticed as, I observe the behavior of the church and I read the writings of the church and even, reflect on my own communication with God's people. We talk about sin, but we sometimes fail to grasp the seriousness. All right, we sometimes fail to give proper acknowledgement to just exactly what sin is and why it is so bad. We almost try to mention it in passing in our hurry to get to the redemption side of things, right? We talk about being forgiven of our sin and hardly ever just talk about the word without that forgiveness in front. And I get that we're trying to be cognizant of Christ's sacrifice and the blessings that we receive because of Christ's sacrifice, and that is not inappropriate at all. However, unless we appreciate exactly what sin is and the nature of it and the damage that it does and our state because of it, we really can't appreciate Christ's sacrifice. We're doing a disservice to the price that was paid if we don't stop to think about how great that price truly was. And so this morning, I want to take a little bit of time, or I guess whenever you happen to be watching this, I want to take a little bit of time talking about what sin is and why it's such a problem and how we can better understand it. I want to begin with a concept, and it's one that I think most of us are familiar with. We find the concept in Leviticus 22 and verse 19, as well as other places. We find a similar idea in 1 John chapter 1 and verse 5, where we're told that God is light and in him is no darkness at all. In Leviticus, we read that the lamb that was to be sacrificed was to be a perfect specimen, one without spot or blemish. And that concept is the beginning of us being able to wrap our heads around sin, because we all understand imperfection, right? We live with it every day, all right? And because we sort of understand imperfection, we can use that as a springboard to sort of point us in the direction that we eventually want to go here. And so the point that we want to start with is that God is perfect. He's holy. He's pure. And we understand in our own human way that purity is only purity if it's undefiled, if it's unspoiled. Right? The moment that we insert one little impurity, right? Think about a perfectly clear glass of water. Nothing in there but 100% H2O. And that's only true, okay, as long as there's nothing else in there. But as soon as even one little drop of something impure goes in there, right, we realize it's no longer pure. It no longer has that status. Well, God is pure. He's perfect. He's holy. And so sin could, in a rudimentary way, be understood as anything that violates the purity of God, anything that interrupts that purity. And of course, certainly we know we're not perfect, right? And so just by our very nature as humans, we're not qualified to be in fellowship with God. And so sin, again, because of its nature, removes us from fellowship with God. More fully, though, I think we could go one step further and explain that sin, by its nature, and really what makes sin, okay, is that it violates the nature of God. Right? Sin violates the nature of God. And in fact, that's how we come about, that's how we can come to an understanding of what exactly sin is, by considering who God is. All right, so for a minute, I want to just point this out. So, when we think about what sin is, we often think of it's a violation of some rule, right? We do this thing and we do that thing, or we don't do this thing or we don't do that thing. And because of that, we've done wrong, and therefore it's sin. But that's really not, it's not the violation of the rule that makes sin sin. It's the violation of God's character. All right, so the way we arrive at sin, the way we can better understand sin, is to understand it as contrary or opposite to God. And so when we think of those characteristics of God, John 1:48, God is love. Hebrews 13:8 and Micah 7:18 through 19, God is faithful and unchanging. Isaiah 6:3, God is holy. Isaiah 30 and Romans 12:19, I guess Isaiah 30:18, Romans 12:19, Deuteronomy 32 and verse 4, God is just. Isaiah 41, Psalms 145 verse 17, God is righteous. And so we think about these characteristics of God. And the reason I bring this up, you go, Kevin, these are all good things. What does this have to do with a discussion of sin? Well, all of these characteristics of God is what actually defines sin. Sin is anything that's contrary to those characteristics, anything that violates the nature of God, anything that is inconsistent with the character of God is sin. Okay, so God just didn't sit up in heaven and write a list of rules and say, yeah, this looks like a pretty good list. Let's make these sins and, these other things over here. This list is all good stuff and we'll make it, virtues. That's not how it worked. Okay? Sin is sin because it's contrary to who God is and what he is. And so when we commit sin, we do that which is antagonistic toward the nature of God. Right? And that's why it separates us from him. Right? If you think about physical laws, right, there are some things that just aren't going to work because of the nature of how the world is. And that's what sin is to God. Having sin, being close to God, is just not going to work. It's a spiritual law, just the way that we have physical laws that we have to observe. And so if we think about this for a moment, I want to remind you of two things here in terms of us as humans. First, as humans from the beginning, we were designed, we were created in the image of God. And so those characteristics of love and faithfulness and justice, those things are supposed to be a part of who we are. Right? And so when we sin, we violate, we make the fall that much worse because we embrace it in our lives to a greater extent. Okay, but furthermore, when we as God's covenant people sin, we violate the commitment that we've made to follow him. Right? When we repent and we turn, we're turning to be with Jesus, to live as he would want us to live and as he would have lived. And so, for example, Romans chapter 8, verse 29 says that we're called to be conformed to his image. Philippians 2 and verse 5 says we're to have his mind. Right? We're to be becoming more and more like Jesus. And when we sin, right, we turn that whole thing on its head. Remember 1 Peter chapter 1, be holy for I am holy. 1 John chapter 2 and verse 29, if you know that he is righteous, that is God is righteous, you may be sure that everyone who practices righteousness has been born of him. Right? And so those are just a couple of examples to demonstrate that God's people share God's characteristics. And sin is the total opposite to what God's characteristics are. If you were to take the characteristics of God and turn them completely on their head, right, to violate them completely, to do that which is totally opposite, that is sin. And now for God's people then, who are called to be like him, who have been made holy through his sacrifice, for them to go ahead and do that which is completely opposite, which flies in the face of the very nature of God, seems so inappropriate and so wildly and horribly wrong. The Bible repeatedly warns us, and I purposely went out and found all of these lists. And I know it's going to be a little bit monotonous, but I want to share them with you to make a point. Because the Bible, one, lists some things over and over and over again as sins, but two, it lists the consequences of those things over and over again, just to drive this point home that we're trying to make. Now, one of the things I want to say to you, I'm going to share with you a bunch of scriptures right now, and I would challenge you. We can't do it here and now because this sermon would be, another hour longer than it's already going to be, and it's not going to be an hour, I promise. But I would challenge you to go and look at the lists that I'm about to give you, where we see the discussion of what things are sinful and the consequences of those things, and then take some time and examine each of the things on these lists and consider why they are contrary to God's nature. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9 through 11. Or don't you know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived, neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor men who practice homosexuality, nor thieves, nor greedy, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God. Galatians chapter 5 and verse 19. Now, by the way, every time I'm going to bring a bunch of these up, and sometimes there'll be a contrasting list that we're not going to dwell on today. All right, but I know, for example, this passage, people always bring up Galatians 5:22 as the fruits of the Spirit. But they bring it up. It's literally halfway through a thought. The thought begins with the works of the flesh. And Paul says they're evident: sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, rivalries, dissension, division, envy, drunkenness, orgies, and things like these. I warn you, as I warned you before, that those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. Ephesians 5:3, but sexual immorality, and impurity, covetousness, but must not even be named among you, as is proper among the saints. Let there be no filthiness or foolish talk nor crude joking, which are out of place, but instead let there be thanksgiving. For you may be sure of this, that everyone who is sexually immoral or impure, or who is covetous, I don't know why I'm having such a hard time with these words. Notice he calls covetousness idolatry. He says that is an idolater. Has no inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of these things the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. Colossians 3:5-9. Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you: sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desires, covetousness, which is idolatry. On account of these, the wrath of God is coming. In these too you once walked when you were living in them, but now you must put them all away: anger, wrath, malice, slander, obscene talk from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have put off the old self with its practices. 1 Timothy 1, 9 through 10. Understanding this, that the law is not laid down for the just, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the ungodly and sinners, for the unholy and profane, for those who strike their fathers and mothers, for murderers, the sexually immoral, men who practice homosexuality, enslavers, liars, perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine. And then finally, one that probably many of you could quote, Revelation chapter 21, verse 8. But as for the cowardly, the faithless, the detestable, as for murderers, the sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars, their portion will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. Now, these verses tell me two important things. Number one, notice the repetitive nature. Over and over and over again, we see people who do this stuff cannot be part of God's kingdom. They have no inheritance from God. That is, they can't anticipate eternity in heaven. Now, the reason, the thing that stands out to me about all of this tells me that there were obviously people trying to tell Christians that you can engage in immoral behavior and it's fine. You don't need to worry about it. Okay? Over and over again, Paul has to say, look, if you engage in this immoral, ungodly behavior, you cannot anticipate eternity in heaven. All right, so that's the first point. The second point is that very thing, that these things separate you from God. Right? You can't have fellowship with God and be in sin, because sin, as we've been saying, sin by its very nature separates you. It can't be part of who God is. Now, I want to add a couple of other verses because they remind us, most of the stuff we talked about would be seen as bad stuff here. But there are some other things that are identified as sins that we don't always think about. And that is when we don't live up to what God has called us to do. Okay, that is, we don't specifically go out and do something that is listed as wrong, but we fail to do what's right. Right. We focused largely in these other verses on sort of moral issues, and clearly that was a problem, and it remains to be a problem for the church, or the Bible wouldn't repeat it that many times. But here in James chapter 4 and verse 17, James says, whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, to him it is sin. So now, we're not thinking about actively doing something wrong. We're thinking about not doing what's right. That has a lot to do with attitude and intent, I would say. Numbers chapter 20, verses 8 through 12. This is a difficult one and a challenging one, I think. Moses, it said, lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank and their livestock. Now, what happens here in the book of Numbers is that Moses is told, because he struck the rock and didn't speak to it the way God had told him to, he's not going to enter the promised land. Leviticus chapter 10, verses 1 through 2. Nadab and Abihu, sons of Aaron, each took his censer and put fire in it and laid incense on it and offered unauthorized fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. Here again, Nadab and Abihu knew what God's expectations were, and they failed to do it. Okay. And this is a problem because it violates God's faithfulness. And in fact, it violates our response to God's faithfulness to us is faithfulness to him. So God will never say something and not do it. Right? He'll never betray our trust. And what he wants from us is the same, an attitude that says, okay, God, if you say it, right, just as I can trust your words, you can trust my actions. Right? I'm going to obey. I'm going to follow you. And so Moses didn't do it. Even if it was just in a small thing, Right? The point wasn't that striking the rock was inherently sinful. The problem was Moses was supposed to obey. The problem again in Leviticus is not that, lighting a fire of any kind is wrong. Okay, but when God tells you to use a specific fire, that's the one you have to use. And these passages and this concept as it relates to our response to God's faithfulness is one that I often contemplate when I think about our own worship service. Why do we obey God? Why are we careful to do in our worship the things that God has authorized? Right? There are lots of things that I like. All right, I like playing guitar, I like riding my bike, I like exercising. The list could go on and on. I don't do any of those things in worship. You know why? Because they're not worship. God didn't tell me to do anything like that. And if God didn't tell you, it isn't worship. Right? You're doing the same thing as Nadab and Abihu. You're putting your own will in front of God's. And so if someone were to suggest to me, is it really a big deal that we have the fruit of the vine and unleavened bread? I'd say, no, it's not. Right? Just like I would say, is it a big deal that you light a fire? Nope. Nothing wrong with that. However, if we're having communion, then it's a big deal. Because God has told us what to do, and any violation of what God has said is a huge deal. Because God has promised us that His word will never fail. That when He speaks, we can bank on it. We can take it and trust it with our whole hearts. And the appropriate response to that is for us to say, the same God, just as when you speak, we can trust you. When you speak, you can trust us. And so what we need to be doing is seeking God's will in all things. If we truly want to be with Him, if we truly want to be His people, if we love Him the way that we say we do, if we truly want to respond as we should to the sacrifice that was made so that we could be free from sin, then that involves doing all we can to know and do the will of God. And so we've said all that. The next point that I want to make is really to go back to a point I just briefly touched on, and that is that sin is a problem all of us have. Romans chapter 3, verse 23, right? All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And it has the same consequence for all of us. It separates us from God. And it doesn't matter how big or how small that sin is, the consequence, the result is the same because of the nature of sin. Right? Because sin is contrary to who God is. It's contrary to His nature as a being. He can have nothing to do with it. Right? It's a spiritual law. It's like oil and water. Right? If I put oil and water in a bottle, they separate from each other. It's because of their chemical properties that they just separate. Right? Now, it doesn't matter why I added the oil to the water. It doesn't matter what my intent was. It doesn't matter what I want. It's a spiritual law. It's a physical law, separate and apart from my intent. And the same is true of sin and the nature of God. They are separated from each other. That's just how it is. And there is nothing that you or I can do to fix that. Sin, by its nature, separates. It's not of God. And so over the last little bit, we've talked a lot about sin. And I hope that it's been a good and clear reminder of what sin is and why sin is what it is. I often get questions about, well, why is this wrong or why is that wrong? Well, now we can hopefully understand a little bit about why things are wrong. It's God's nature that makes sin what it is. And so, as we think about being faithful and avoiding sin, we can understand that it's not about not breaking rules. Right? Committing sin is not like, committing icing or being offside at a hockey game. It's not a violation of this arbitrary rule that's been devised. It's a violation of the nature of God and even of the nature of man. Sin is doing that which is contrary to who God is and who He's created us to be. It violates our purpose as His people. Remember that we exist to glorify God. And when we sin, we cease being able to reflect His glory any longer. Sin is not to be avoided just because it hurts us. Right? Sin is bad for us. There's a strong correlation. There's a strong connection between, hey, if you do this, bad things will happen. Yes, they will. But that's not why we avoid sin. We avoid sin because we are God's people and we want with all of our soul and all of our hearts and all of our minds to be like Him. And sin is contrary to Him, and therefore it's contrary to us. Right? Any other physical circumstance that we may suffer is secondary. And so today and every day, we pray that God, through Christ, will keep us from sin. Will draw us close to Him and protect us from temptation. We thank God for Jesus, whose blood washes us clean and removes the blemish of sin, restoring us to the holy state that we need to be in order to have fellowship with our God and our Creator. And I hope that after taking some time to reflect on what sin is, we'll understand why it's to be avoided. It's not about being, disciplined and avoiding, not about being disciplined and strictly adhering to a set of laws. It's about loving God and putting Him and His will first. And so I know that there's a huge portion that's left out of this lesson. And that, of course, is the remedy for sin. That is what we'll get into next week.